They say the corporate world will chew you up and spit you out, but nobody warns you about the taste it leaves in your mouth. Mine tasted like betrayal, served cold on a Tuesday morning at 6:47 a.m. when I opened my laptop to find 3 sentences that obliterated 4 years of my life. No phone call, no meeting. Just an email with the subject line that read like a funeral notice: employment termination, effective immediately. The message was clinical, sterile, designed to strip away any humanity from what they were doing to me. Dear employee, not even my name. Due to restructuring, your position has been eliminated. Please return all company property by Friday. HR will contact you regarding final paperwork. That was it. 4 years reduced to corporate template language that could have been sent to anyone, anywhere, for any reason. I stared at those words until they blurred together, my coffee growing cold in my hands as the reality sank in. 2 weeks earlier, I had closed the biggest deal in the company's history. 2 weeks ago, I was the golden girl who could do no wrong. Now I was just another casualty of restructuring, that beautiful corporate euphemism that makes firing people sound like interior decorating. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Morrison, and if you had told me 5 years ago that I would become the woman who brought down a consulting firm with nothing but spreadsheets and client loyalty, I would have laughed in your face. Back then, I was just another ambitious MBA graduate drowning in student debt, armed with business theories and zero real-world experience, desperate to prove that my Northwestern education was worth the mortgage-sized loan I'd taken out to pay for it. The betrayal that morning in my Lincoln Park apartment hit me deeper than professional disappointment could explain. It transported me back to being 12 years old, sitting at the top of the stairs in my childhood home in Naperville, listening to my mother sob in the kitchen after she'd been let go from Morrison, Patterson & Associates. She had worked there for 8 years, staying late every night, coming in on weekends, missing school plays and soccer games to prove her dedication to partners who saw her as nothing more than an expendable resource. That night, when she thought I was asleep, I heard her whisper to my father through broken sobs, "I gave them everything. How could they just throw me away like I never mattered?" The raw pain in her voice embedded itself in my 12-year-old heart like a splinter that never healed. I promised myself that night, lying in my bed with tears streaming down my face, that I would never allow myself to be that vulnerable. I would never give anyone the power to make me feel disposable. Yet, here I was, 31 years old, sitting in my pajamas with that same hollow ache spreading through my chest, realizing that despite all my preparation and ambition, I had walked straight into the same trap that had destroyed my mother's faith in corporate America. The difference was that I wasn't the naive woman who had started at Premier Consulting Solutions 4 years earlier. I wasn't the eager graduate who believed that hard work and results would automatically translate to respect and security. I had learned to document everything. I had learned to build relationships that extended beyond company walls. Most importantly, I had learned that loyalty flows both ways, and when it doesn't, you better have a backup plan that doesn't depend on other people's integrity. Premier Consulting Solutions occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in Chicago's Loop, with windows that offered stunning views of Lake Michigan on clear days and reflected the harsh reality of corporate hierarchy on cloudy ones. When I first walked through those doors in September 2019, the company was bleeding money and talent in equal measure. Half the cubicles sat empty, a depressing reminder of the downsizing that had preceded my arrival. The break room coffee machine was broken. The carpet bore stains from the last person who had tried to make their mark, and the conference room chairs were mismatched casualties from different eras of office furniture. Marcus Thompson, the CEO who had hired me, was everything you'd expect from someone trying to save a sinking ship with nothing but charm and networking connections. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of confident smile that had probably gotten him through business school and his first decade of career advancement. He wore expensive suits that couldn't quite hide the desperation in his eyes, the look of a man who knew he was one bad quarter away from having to explain to investors why their mid-tier consulting firm couldn't compete with the industry giants. During my interview, he leaned back in his leather chair and gestured toward the half-empty office with the enthusiasm of someone selling prime real estate. "We need fresh blood, Sarah. Someone who can think outside the box and bring innovative solutions to our client acquisition challenges. The big firms are stuck in their old ways, but we have the agility to be different. We just need someone with your background to help us capitalize on that advantage." I was 27, armed with an MBA from Northwestern and enough theoretical knowledge to fill a textbook, but zero practical experience in the brutal reality of business development. My student loans totaled more than most people's annual salaries, and I was facing the choice between taking a risk with a struggling company or continuing to send resumes into the void of corporate recruiting systems that seemed designed to make qualified candidates disappear. Marcus offered me $55,000 a year to join as a business development associate, a title that sounded impressive enough to justify my degree while keeping my compensation low enough to fit their struggling budget. "We believe in merit-based advancement," he assured me, his smile widening as if he was offering me a golden ticket rather than an entry-level position with a company that might not exist in 6 months. "Show us results, and we'll show you opportunities for growth that the big firms can't match." I believed him. More than that, I believed in my ability to make his vision a reality. Looking around that half-empty office, I saw potential where others might have seen failure. I saw a company small enough for my contributions to matter, agile enough to implement my ideas, and desperate enough to give me the opportunities that established firms never would. I saw my chance to prove that the theories I'd learned in business school could translate into real-world results. What I didn't see was how quickly success would be rewritten to exclude the person who created it. My first day at Premier Consulting, Solutions. Marcus walked me around the office like he was introducing me to a thriving enterprise rather than a company that was 2 missed payrolls away from closing its doors. The other employees smiled politely, but I could see the questions in their eyes. How long would I last, and would I be another casualty of the company's financial struggles? Or would I be part of whatever turnaround Marcus kept promising was just around the corner? The office itself told the story of a company that had seen better days. The reception area still displayed awards from 2016 and earlier, back when Premier had been growing and relevant. The motivational posters on the walls looked like they'd been hanging there since the Clinton administration, their edges curled and their messages feeling more ironic than inspiring. The conference room where I'd have my first client meetings still had a crack in the table from someone's overly enthusiastic PowerPoint presentation, and the projector required a 15-minute warm-up period that made every presentation feel like an apology for technical difficulties. But I saw opportunity in the dysfunction. Every problem was a chance to prove my value. Every client complaint was an opening to demonstrate that I could deliver solutions rather than excuses. Every empty desk reminded me that there was room for advancement if I could generate the results that would justify expansion rather than continued downsizing. My desk was in the corner, next to a window that looked out over the Chicago River and the steady stream of people walking to jobs at companies that weren't constantly on the verge of bankruptcy. I spent my first week studying every piece of literature the company had produced, every case study they'd published, every proposal they'd submitted in the past 2 years. The pattern that emerged was depressing, but not surprising. Lots of impressive language, minimal concrete results, and a troubling tendency to overpromise and underdeliver. The client base consisted mostly of small to medium-sized businesses that couldn't afford McKinsey or Deloitte, but needed consulting services that Premier was theoretically equipped to provide. The problem was that the company's reputation had been damaged by years of mediocre performance and high employee turnover. Clients who had worked with Premier in the past were reluctant to return, and prospects were skeptical of a firm that seemed to reinvent itself every 18 months. Marcus spent most of his time in strategic meetings that never seemed to produce actionable strategies, networking events that generated lots of business cards but few actual leads, and conference calls with potential investors who were interested in the company's growth potential but reluctant to commit actual funding. He was always optimistic, always confident that the next quarter would be different, always ready with explanations for why the previous quarter's projections hadn't materialized. Meanwhile, the day-to-day work of actually serving clients fell to a small team of consultants who were talented but overworked, underpaid, and increasingly frustrated with management's disconnect from operational reality. They were the ones staying late to finish projects, dealing with client complaints about missed deadlines, and trying to maintain professional relationships while working for a company that seemed more interested in appearances than results. I realized quickly that if I wanted to succeed at Premier, I couldn't rely on the company's existing systems or Marcus's leadership. I would need to build my own network, develop my own client relationships, and create my own track record of success. The company's weakness would become my opportunity if I was smart enough to recognize it and disciplined enough to capitalize on it. That realization should have been my first warning that I was working for a company that would take credit for my success while distancing itself from any responsibility for supporting it. But I was 27, ambitious, and convinced that merit would be rewarded if I just worked hard enough to make it impossible to ignore. I had no idea that making yourself indispensable to people who don't value loyalty is the first step toward making yourself a target for elimination. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Transformation of Premier Consulting Solutions from a struggling firm to a growing company didn't happen overnight, but it happened fast enough that Marcus could convince himself and others that it was the result of his strategic vision, rather than my 16-hour workdays and relentless client outreach. While he attended networking lunches and gave interviews about the company's innovative approach to business consulting, I was cold calling Fortune 500 companies, researching their pain points, and crafting customized proposals that addressed their specific challenges rather than recycling generic templates. My first major breakthrough came 6 months after I started, when I managed to get a meeting with Janet Morrison at Sterling Manufacturing. The irony of the shared last name wasn't lost on me, and I used it as an icebreaker during our initial phone call. "Morrison to Morrison," I said with a laugh. "We should at least hear each other out." She agreed to a 30-minute coffee meeting that turned into a 2-hour discussion about Sterling's supply chain inefficiencies and the consulting firms that had failed to deliver meaningful solutions. Sterling Manufacturing was exactly the type of client that Premier needed: large enough to generate significant revenue, complex enough to showcase our capabilities, and frustrated enough with their current consulting relationships to consider working with a smaller firm that could provide more personalized attention. They were hemorrhaging money due to supply chain disruptions that their previous consultants had diagnosed correctly, but failed to address effectively. I spent 2 weeks preparing for my formal presentation to Sterling's executive team, researching every aspect of their business, analyzing their competitors' supply chain strategies, and developing a comprehensive plan that went beyond identifying problems to provide specific, actionable solutions. The proposal I submitted was 47 pages of detailed analysis, implementation timelines, and success metrics that demonstrated not just what we would do, but how we would measure our progress and ensure accountability. The presentation itself took place in Sterling's headquarters in Schaumburg, a gleaming office complex that made Premier's shabby conference room look like a community center meeting space. I walked into a boardroom filled with executives who had heard promises from consultants before and had the skeptical expressions of people who expected to be disappointed again. Janet Morrison introduced me as the young woman from Premier who thinks she can solve our supply chain problems, and I could hear the doubt in her voice. But I had done my homework. I knew their business better than some of their own managers did. When the VP of Operations asked about lead time optimization, I had specific recommendations for their 3 most problematic suppliers. When the CFO questioned the ROI projections, I had conservative and aggressive scenarios with detailed assumptions for each. When the CEO asked what made my approach different from the previous consultants, I showed them a side-by-side comparison of generic recommendations versus customized solutions based on their actual data. By the end of the 90-minute presentation, the skeptical expressions had been replaced by engaged interest and detailed questions about implementation timelines. Janet Morrison was taking notes. The CFO was nodding approvingly at my financial projections, and the CEO was asking when we could start. 2 weeks later, Sterling Manufacturing signed a $3 million contract with Premier Consulting Solutions for comprehensive supply chain optimization services. Marcus was ecstatic, naturally. The Sterling deal represented more revenue than Premier had generated in the previous 6 months combined, and it provided the credibility boost that the company desperately needed to attract other major clients. But even as he celebrated the success, I noticed how quickly the narrative shifted from Sarah's proposal to our innovative approach to the team's collaborative effort. During the company-wide meeting where Marcus announced the Sterling contract, he stood at the front of our small conference room with a smile that suggested he had personally negotiated the deal through his superior strategic thinking. This is what happens when we focus on our core competencies and leverage our unique positioning in the market, he told the assembled staff, most of whom had contributed exactly nothing to winning the Sterling business. It's a testament to our collaborative approach and our commitment to client success. I sat in the back of the room, listening to Marcus take credit for work that had consumed my evenings and weekends for a month, and felt the first stirring of the resentment that would eventually consume our professional relationship. But I was still naive enough to believe that success would speak for itself, that results would eventually be attributed to the person who generated them, and that my contributions would be recognized as the company continued to grow. The Sterling. Success opened doors that had been closed to Premier for years. Other manufacturing companies heard about our work and wanted to explore similar engagements. Janet Morrison became an informal ambassador for our services, recommending us to colleagues at industry conferences and vouching for our capabilities in ways that no amount of marketing could achieve. Within 3 months of closing the Sterling deal, I had qualified leads with 4 other potential clients, each representing millions of dollars in potential revenue. But success at Premier came with an unexpected price. The more valuable I became to the company's bottom line, the more invisible I became in the company's public narrative. Marcus's confidence grew with every new client meeting, every positive reference, every contract renewal. He began positioning himself as the architect of Premier's turnaround, the visionary leader who had transformed a struggling consulting firm into a growing enterprise through strategic thinking and innovative client service. The reality was quite different. While Marcus attended industry conferences and gave interviews about Premier's unique market positioning, I was working 18-hour days to deliver on the promises he was making. While he networked with other executives and built his personal brand as a thought leader, I was troubleshooting client problems, refining service delivery processes, and developing the expertise that made Premier's reputation for excellence possible. The pattern became clear after my second major client win, when Meridian Financial Services signed a $8 million contract for risk management consulting. I had spent months building relationships with Meridian's leadership team, understanding their regulatory challenges and developing customized solutions that addressed their specific compliance requirements. The proposal process had been grueling, involving multiple presentations, detailed technical specifications, and competitive bidding against firms with 10 times our resources. When Meridian finally chose Premier, Marcus was quick to position the win as validation of his strategic vision for the company's growth. In the press release that announced the contract, He was quoted extensively about Premier's innovative approach to financial services consulting and the company's commitment to delivering measurable results for our clients. My name appeared once in the final paragraph as part of the talented team of consultants who would be supporting the engagement. But the clients knew who had earned their business. Janet Morrison at Sterling specifically requested that I lead their project implementation. Tom Chen at Meridian Financial insisted that I be the primary point of contact for all strategic discussions. Patricia Wells at Pacific Industries, which became my third major client win with a $2 million contract, told Marcus directly that they were hiring Premier because they wanted to work with me specifically. These client relationships became my most valuable professional asset, though I didn't fully understand their importance at the time. While Marcus focused on building his own reputation and expanding his network of fellow executives, I was developing deep, trust-based relationships with decision-makers at major corporations who valued my expertise and relied on my judgment. These weren't transactional vendor relationships. They were partnerships built on mutual respect and proven results. Over the next 4 years, I brought in $4 million in new business for Premier Consulting Solutions, not collaborative team efforts or joint business development initiatives. Individual client relationships that I had built, nurtured, and converted into signed contracts through my own research, proposals, and presentations. The company grew from 12 employees to 47. We moved from our shabby offices to a prestigious address with views of Lake Michigan. Marcus started wearing custom suits and driving a Tesla that cost more than my annual salary. But with every success, the credit seemed to flow further away from the person who had generated it and toward the person who was best positioned to claim it. My victories became the company's achievements. My client relationships became Premier's strategic partnerships. My expertise became the team's collaborative capabilities. I should have seen the warning signs. I should have recognized that a boss who takes credit for your success will eventually see you as a threat to be eliminated rather than an asset to be valued. But I was still operating under the naive assumption that exceptional performance would eventually be rewarded with recognition, advancement, and job security. I had no idea that making yourself indispensable to someone who doesn't value loyalty is actually the fastest way to make yourself expendable. The moment everything changed came on a rainy Thursday in March, when Marcus walked into the office with someone I had never seen before, but whose presence immediately shifted the energy in the room. The stranger was tall, blonde, and carried himself with the casual confidence of someone who had never had to prove his worth through late nights and weekend work. His handshake was firm, his smile was practiced, and his suit was expensive enough to signal that he wasn't here for an entry-level position. Marcus gathered the entire team in the main conference room, his excitement palpable as he prepared to make what he clearly considered a momentous announcement. The staff filed in with the weary expressions of people who had been through enough company meetings to know that sudden gatherings rarely brought good news for existing employees. I took my usual seat near the back, notebook in hand, prepared to document another one of Marcus's strategic initiatives that would somehow require more work from everyone except Marcus himself. "I'm thrilled to introduce you all to Brad Peterson," Marcus began, his arm draped around the newcomer's shoulders like they were old friends reuniting at a high school reunion. "Brad is joining us as our new Vice President of Business Development, and he brings exactly the kind of enterprise leadership experience that will take Premier to the next level." The words hit me like a physical blow. Vice President of Business Development. The exact title I had been requesting in every performance review for the past 2 years. The position Marcus had repeatedly told me I wasn't ready for. That required a different skill set that needed someone with more strategic thinking capabilities. Now he was handing it to someone who had walked through our doors 5 minutes ago. Brad stepped forward with the easy confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the corporate hierarchy. "I'm excited to be here and to work with such a talented team," he said, his voice carrying the smooth polish of countless networking events and client presentations. I'm looking forward to building on the solid foundation you've all created and helping Premier expand into new markets and opportunities." The irony was suffocating. The solid foundation he was talking about building on was primarily my work. The new markets and opportunities he planned to explore were relationships I had been cultivating for months. The business development strategies he would be implementing were concepts I had proposed, and Marcus had filed away for future consideration. After the meeting, as the staff dispersed with the stunned silence of people processing unwelcome news, Marcus pulled me aside with the patronizing smile he reserved for conversations where he planned to deliver disappointment disguised as opportunity. "Sarah, I wanted to talk to you privately about how Brad's addition to the team will affect your role here." I waited, already knowing that whatever came next would be wrapped in corporate speak designed to make a demotion sound like a promotion, a loss of responsibility sound like a strategic refocusing of my talents. "With Brad taking over the strategic business development functions, you'll be able to focus on what you do best," Marcus continued, his tone suggesting he was offering me a gift rather than stripping away years of career progress. "Client execution, project management, the operational excellence that makes our proposals so compelling. It's really going to allow you to shine in your core competencies." Core competencies. The phrase made my skin crawl. It was corporate code for "stay in your lane," a polite way of telling me that my contributions were valuable enough to keep, but not important enough to acknowledge. I was being relegated to execution while someone else would get credit for strategy. Pushed back into the shadows while Brad stepped into the spotlight I had earned through results. "What about the clients I've been developing relationships with?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "Sterling, Meridian, Pacific Industries. They specifically requested to work with me on their strategic initiatives." Marcus waved his hand dismissively, as if my question demonstrated exactly the kind of limited thinking that made me unsuitable for leadership roles. "Those relationships belong to Premier, Sarah. Brad will be taking over all major client relationships to ensure consistency in our strategic approach. You'll still be involved in delivery, of course, but we need someone with Brad's background handling the relationship management side." The audacity was breathtaking. The relationships that had generated millions of dollars in revenue, that had transformed Premier from a failing company into a growing enterprise, that had been built through my personal investment of time, energy, and expertise, were being transferred to someone who couldn't spell the clients' names correctly. Marcus was essentially telling me that 4 years of relationship building meant nothing, that client trust and rapport were interchangeable commodities that could be handed off like case files. But I had learned to control my reactions, to process betrayal without giving my opponents the satisfaction of seeing how deeply their cuts had landed. "I understand," I said simply, though understanding and accepting were two entirely different things. "I'm sure Brad will do a great job." The transition was as painful as I had expected it to be. Brad moved into the corner office that had been empty since the last VP of Business Development had been fired for incompetence 2 years earlier. He immediately began scheduling meetings with my clients to introduce himself as their new primary contact, armed with briefing documents I had prepared and relationship histories I had meticulously maintained. The first disaster came within a week during Brad's introductory call with Janet Morrison at Sterling Manufacturing. I wasn't included in the meeting, naturally, but Janet called me directly afterward with a tone that mixed confusion with irritation. "Sarah, I just got off the phone with your new VP and I have to ask, does he understand our business at all?" The question was rhetorical. Brad had spent the entire call talking about Sterling's supply chain optimization opportunities, using language lifted directly from our original proposal, but without understanding the context that made those recommendations relevant. He had suggested strategies that Sterling had already implemented, proposed solutions to problems they had already solved, and demonstrated such a fundamental misunderstanding of their operations that Janet questioned whether Premier was still the right consulting partner for their needs. "He kept referring to notes and seemed to be reading from a script," Janet continued. When I asked about the integration challenges we discussed last month, he had no idea what I was talking about. Is everything okay over there? I spent 30 minutes reassuring Janet that Premier remained committed to delivering the high-quality service she had come to expect, that Brad was still getting up to speed on the details of their engagement, and that I would personally ensure continuity in their project delivery. But I could hear the doubt in her voice, the same skepticism that clients develop when they realize their trusted advisor has been replaced by someone who doesn't understand their business. The Sterling call was just the beginning. Within 2 weeks, Brad had managed to create problems with 3 of my major clients through a combination of overconfidence and ignorance that would have been amusing if it weren't so professionally devastating. He promised Meridian Financial a project timeline that was impossible to meet given their regulatory requirements. He quoted Pacific Industries a price for additional services that would have lost money on the engagement. He suggested a strategic initiative to Douglas Manufacturing that they had specifically rejected 6 months earlier. Each mistake required me to work behind the scenes to repair relationships and restore client confidence. I found myself apologizing for decisions I hadn't made, explaining away confusion I hadn't created, and reassuring clients that their projects would be delivered successfully despite the chaos Brad was creating at the relationship management level. The cruel irony was that while I was working overtime to clean up Brad's mistakes, Marcus was praising his fresh perspective and innovative thinking in staff meetings. Brad's ability to ask questions that demonstrated his lack of industry knowledge was reframed as challenging assumptions. His confusion about client requirements was described as bringing outside perspective to complex problems. His tendency to overpromise and underdeliver was characterized as ambitious goal setting that pushes the team to exceed expectations. Meanwhile, my efforts to maintain client relationships and project quality were treated as routine operational tasks that anyone could perform. The crisis management skills I was deploying daily to keep Premier's reputation intact went unrecognized and unappreciated. The additional hours I was working to compensate for Brad's learning curve were seen as part of my normal job responsibilities, rather than evidence of his inadequacy. But I was documenting everything. Every client complaint about Brad's performance. Every project delay caused by his misunderstanding of requirements. Every additional cost incurred because of his overly optimistic promises. Every conversation where I had to reassure frustrated clients that their concerns were being addressed. I had learned from my mother's experience that corporate loyalty was a one-way street, and I wasn't going to be caught unprepared when the road inevitably led to a dead end. Every email was saved to personal folders. Every client interaction was recorded in detailed notes with timestamps and context. Every example of Brad's incompetence was documented with specific dates and measurable impacts. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly Marcus would move from tolerating Brad's learning curve to actively protecting him from the consequences of his mistakes. When Janet Morrison sent a formal complaint about Brad's handling of her account, Marcus responded by assigning me to support Brad's client relationship management, without acknowledging that the support was necessary because of Brad's failures. When Tom Chen at Meridian Financial requested that I resume my role as primary contact for their engagement, Marcus declined the request and sent Brad to a relationship management training seminar instead. The message was clear. Premier would rather invest in training Brad to do my job than acknowledge that I was already doing it better than he ever would. The final insult came during my annual performance review, 6 months after Brad's arrival. Marcus sat across from his desk in his expensive suit, reviewing a document that supposedly evaluated my contributions to the company over the past year. The evaluation was professional, complimentary, and completely disconnected from reality. "You've done excellent work this year, Sarah," Marcus began, his tone suggesting he was delivering good news rather than managing expectations. "Your project management skills continue to be top-notch, and your attention to detail is exactly what our clients value about Premier's service delivery." Project management skills, attention to detail, the kind of generic praise that could be applied to any competent employee. No mention of the $4 and $2 million in new business I had generated. No acknowledgement of the client relationships I had saved from Brad's mismanagement. No recognition of the crisis management and damage control that had kept Premier's reputation intact while Brad learned on the job. However, Marcus continued, and I knew that everything positive he had said was just set up for the criticism that would justify whatever disappointing decision he had already made. We need to work on your collaboration skills. Brad has mentioned that you sometimes seem resistant to his strategic initiatives, and we need everyone to be aligned behind our new business development approach. Collaboration skills. I was being criticized for not being enthusiastic enough about cleaning up someone else's mistakes. My resistance to Brad's strategic initiatives was actually my professional judgment that his ideas were uninformed and potentially damaging to client relationships. But Marcus had already decided that any conflict between Brad and me must be my fault, because acknowledging Brad's incompetence would require admitting that his hiring decision had been a mistake. "I've been thinking about your career development," Marcus said, transitioning into what I realized was the real purpose of this meeting. "And I believe you would benefit from some additional training in strategic thinking and executive presence. There are some excellent leadership development programs that could help you develop the skills necessary for advancement here at Premier." Leadership development programs. Translation: You're not ready for promotion, and we're going to send you away for training that will keep you busy while we continue to promote people who haven't earned advancement through actual performance. It was the corporate equivalent of being sent to your room while the adults made decisions about your future. But the most devastating part of the review came when Marcus outlined my goals for the following year. Instead of expanding my responsibilities or acknowledging my track record of success, he was essentially formalizing my demotion. My primary objectives would be supporting Brad's business development initiatives, improving collaboration with senior leadership, and focusing on operational excellence in project delivery. I was being transformed from a business developer into a project manager, from a relationship builder into a support function, from someone who generated millions in revenue into someone whose job was to make other people look good. 4 years of exceptional performance had earned me the privilege of watching someone else take credit for my work, while I focused on execution and collaboration. As I sat in that meeting, listening to Marcus rewrite history and redefine my contributions in ways that diminished their importance while elevating Brad's potential, I felt something inside me crystallize into perfect clarity. This wasn't about performance or qualifications or strategic thinking capabilities. This was about power, perception, and the fundamental unfairness of a system that rewards connections over contributions. Marcus could afford to undervalue me because he assumed I had no alternatives. He could transfer my clients to Brad because he believed client relationships belonged to the company rather than the individual who built them. He could criticize my collaboration while ignoring Brad's incompetence because he had already decided that his hiring decision was correct and any evidence to the contrary must be explained away. But Marcus had made one critical miscalculation. He assumed that 4 years of loyalty meant I would continue to accept diminishing returns on my investment in Premier's success. He assumed that my commitment to client service meant I would indefinitely subsidize Brad's learning curve at the expense of my own career advancement. He assumed that I would continue to be grateful for the opportunity to work at Premier, even as that opportunity became less valuable and more demoralizing with each passing month. What Marcus didn't understand was that loyalty has limits, and he had just exceeded mine. What he didn't realize was that the client relationships he was so casually transferring to Brad were built on personal trust that couldn't be reassigned through organizational charts. What he failed to grasp was that the person he was systematically undervaluing and marginalizing was the same person who held the keys to Premier's continued success. I walked out of that performance review with perfect clarity about my situation and my options. Premier Consulting Solutions had made its position clear. I was valuable enough to keep, but not important enough to promote, skilled enough to clean, up other people's mistakes but not qualified to make strategic decisions, loyal enough to be taken for granted but not respected enough to be treated fairly. But they had also given me something invaluable: absolute certainty that my future lay somewhere else, and complete moral justification for whatever steps I needed to take to claim it. The game had changed, and it was time for me to start playing by different rules. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it began the moment I walked out of Marcus's office after that humiliating performance review. Something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with Premier Consulting Solutions, a recognition that the company I had helped build no longer valued the person who had built it, but instead of anger or despair, I felt something far more dangerous: calculating clarity. For 4 years, I had operated under the assumption that exceptional performance would eventually be rewarded with recognition and advancement. I had believed that client relationships belonged to the person who built them, that results spoke louder than politics, and that loyalty would be reciprocated by the people who benefited from it. Those assumptions had just been systematically demolished, replaced by a much clearer understanding of how corporate power actually worked. The first thing I did was stop working overtime to compensate for Brad's incompetence. If Premier wanted to position him as the strategic leader of our business development efforts, then Premier could live with the consequences of that decision. I continued to deliver excellent work on my assigned projects, maintained professional relationships with my clients, and fulfilled every requirement of my official job description. But I stopped volunteering for additional responsibilities, stopped offering solutions to problems I hadn't created, and stopped sacrificing my personal time to protect the company from the natural results of its poor decisions. The change was subtle but immediate. When Brad scheduled client calls without understanding the context of ongoing projects, I no longer stayed late to brief him beforehand. When he made promises that were impossible to fulfill, I documented the conversation, but didn't volunteer to make the impossible possible through extra effort. When clients called me directly with concerns about Brad's handling of their accounts, I listened professionally and referred them back to their designated account manager, rather than solving their problems myself. Marcus noticed the shift within 2 weeks, though he couldn't quite articulate what had changed. During our weekly team meetings, he began making pointed comments about team collaboration and supporting our leadership initiatives. He scheduled one-on-one meetings to discuss my attitude and engagement level, conversations that revealed his growing frustration with my refusal to continue subsidizing Brad's learning curve. "Sarah, I'm concerned that you're not fully embracing the new business development structure," Marcus said during one of these sessions, his tone carrying the warning that came before formal disciplinary action. "Brad mentioned that you've been less responsive to his requests for support, and some clients have commented that communication seems fragmented." I maintained my professional composure while internally marveling at the audacity of the criticism. Brad's requests for support were actually requests for me to do his job while he took credit for the results. The fragmented communication he was complaining about was the natural consequence of inserting an incompetent intermediary between clients and the person who actually understood their needs. "I've been focusing on my assigned responsibilities, as outlined in my performance review," I replied evenly. "If there are specific support tasks that fall within my job description, I'm happy to prioritize them appropriately." The response was technically accurate and completely unhelpful, which was exactly what I intended. I wasn't being insubordinate or unprofessional. I was simply declining to volunteer for responsibilities that extended beyond my official role, responsibilities that had previously made other people look good while keeping me invisible. But while I was pulling back from my unofficial role as Premier's problem solver, I was becoming much more proactive about documenting the problems that resulted from that withdrawal. Every client complaint that reached my desk was carefully recorded with dates, details, and context. Every project delay caused by Brad's mismanagement was tracked with measurable impacts on timeline and budget. Every instance of Marcus covering for Brad's mistakes was noted with specific examples of how that protection came at the expense of client satisfaction or operational efficiency. I also began documenting something else: the true source of Premier's major client relationships and revenue streams. Using the CRM system I had meticulously maintained for 4 years, I created detailed reports showing my role in acquiring, developing, and retaining each of the company's major accounts. The data told a story that Marcus preferred to keep buried. Premier's transformation from a failing consultancy to a growing enterprise was directly attributable to my business development efforts, not to his strategic leadership or Brad's fresh perspective. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Sterling manufacturing, initial contact, relationship development, proposal creation, and ongoing account management, all handled by me. Meridian Financial Services, cold outreach, needs. Assessment, customized solution development, and contract negotiation, all my work. Pacific Industries, referral cultivation, competitive positioning, presentation development, and relationship maintenance, entirely my responsibility. The pattern repeated across every major account Premier had acquired during my tenure. But documentation was only the first step in what I was beginning to recognize as a much larger strategy. If Premier no longer valued my contributions enough to reward them appropriately, then perhaps it was time to explore whether other organizations might have a different perspective on my worth. I began updating my resume, not with the generic job descriptions that appeared in my official role at Premier, but with the specific achievements and measurable results that told the real story of my professional impact. The numbers were compelling. $4 million in new business development over 4 years, representing 73% of Premier's revenue growth during that period. Client retention rates of 94% on accounts I managed personally, compared to industry averages of 67%. Project delivery success rates that exceeded client expectations on 89% of engagements I led. These weren't subjective claims about collaboration and strategic thinking. They were objective measures of business impact that any competent organization would value. I also began reaching out to former colleagues who had left Premier for other opportunities, casual conversations that provided insight into how my work was perceived outside the company's internal politics. The feedback was consistent and enlightening. Industry professionals who had worked with me recognized the quality of my strategic thinking, client relationship skills, and project execution capabilities. The limitations on my advancement at Premier were viewed as Premier's loss rather than evidence of my shortcomings. But the most revealing conversations were with the clients themselves. During routine project check-ins and status meetings, I began asking more pointed questions about their satisfaction with Premier's service delivery and account management. The responses confirmed what I had suspected. Most of my major clients viewed me as their primary point of contact, regardless of the organizational chart, trusted my judgment more than they trusted Brad's, and would prefer to work directly with me rather than navigate through layers of corporate hierarchy. Janet Morrison at Sterling Manufacturing was particularly direct during one of our monthly project reviews. "Sarah, can I ask you something off the record?" she said after we had finished discussing their quarterly objectives. "Is everything stable over there at Premier? Brad seems... I don't want to be unkind, but he seems to be learning the basics of our business every time we talk. You've always understood our challenges and objectives without needing constant explanation." The question opened a door I had been waiting for someone else to walk through. "Premier is going through some organizational changes," I replied carefully. "The leadership team is experimenting with different approaches to client relationship management." Janet's expression suggested she understood exactly what I wasn't saying directly. "Well, I hope those experiments don't affect the quality of service we've come to expect. Your understanding of our business and your ability to translate that into actionable recommendations is exactly why we chose Premier in the first place." Similar conversations began happening with other clients. Tom Chen at Meridian Financial made pointed comments about Brad's lack of familiarity with financial services regulations. Patricia Wells at Pacific Industries questioned whether Brad had the industry experience necessary to understand their manufacturing challenges. Douglas Manufacturing's CFO asked directly whether I would continue to be involved in their strategic planning process, expressing concern that changes in account management might affect project continuity. Each conversation reinforced the same fundamental reality. My client relationships were based on personal trust and professional competence that couldn't be transferred through organizational restructuring. The clients weren't loyal to Premier Consulting Solutions. They were loyal to the individual consultant who had earned their confidence through consistent results and deep understanding of their businesses. But I was also learning something else. Through these conversations, several of my clients were frustrated with aspects of Premier's service delivery that went beyond Brad's incompetence. They appreciated my work but were increasingly dissatisfied with the company's responsiveness, flexibility, and ability to adapt quickly to changing requirements. Some were already exploring alternative consulting relationships, not because they were unhappy with me, but because they were tired of dealing with a company that seemed more focused on internal politics than client service. The market intelligence I was gathering through these conversations painted a picture of opportunity that extended far beyond my personal job dissatisfaction. There was genuine demand for consulting services that combined strategic thinking with operational excellence, delivered by professionals who understood client needs rather than corporate hierarchies. Several clients hinted that they would be interested in working with consultants who could provide more personalized attention and faster response times than larger firms typically offered. As winter turned to spring, I found myself in an increasingly untenable position at Premier. Brad's incompetence was becoming more obvious and more costly, but Marcus's investment in protecting his hiring decision was preventing any meaningful course correction. My official responsibilities were becoming more limited and less interesting, while my unofficial role as damage control specialist was becoming more demanding and less sustainable. The breaking point came during Premier's quarterly business review meeting, where Marcus presented the company's performance metrics to the senior staff. He stood at the front of the conference room with a PowerPoint presentation that told a story of continued growth and expanding market opportunities. But the numbers told a different story to anyone who understood how they had been generated. We've maintained strong client retention rates and continue to expand our relationships with existing accounts, Marcus announced, clicking through slides that showed revenue growth and contract renewals without mentioning my role in achieving those results. Our business development initiatives are generating qualified leads at a rate that exceeds industry benchmarks, and our client satisfaction scores remain well above average. Business development initiatives, client satisfaction scores. The language was designed to make collective achievements out of individual performance, to make systematic success out of what was actually the work of one person who was no longer being recognized for her contributions. But the most infuriating moment came when Marcus highlighted Premier's innovative approach to client relationship management as a key differentiator in the competitive consulting marketplace. The innovation he was describing was my methodology for understanding client needs, developing customized solutions, and maintaining ongoing relationships that generated repeat business and referrals. He was literally taking credit for my intellectual property while positioning it as evidence of his strategic leadership. I sat in that meeting, listening to Marcus describe my work as company policy and my results as organizational achievements, and felt the last vestiges of loyalty to Premier Consulting Solutions evaporate completely. The company had made its position clear. My contributions were valuable enough to claim, but not important enough to reward. My relationships were assets to be leveraged, but not accomplishments to be acknowledged. My expertise was a resource to be exploited, but not a capability to be developed through advancement and increased responsibility. But Marcus had also inadvertently provided me with something valuable, a clear understanding of how my work was perceived by someone who took it for granted. his casual appropriation of my achievements, his comfortable assumption that my results belonged to the company rather than the individual who generated them, and his obvious belief that I would continue producing excellent work regardless of how I was treated revealed exactly how little he understood about motivation, loyalty, and the relationship between recognition and performance. That night, I made a decision that had been building for months, but crystallized during Marcus's presentation. Premier Consulting Solutions had taught me everything I needed to know about building client relationships, developing business opportunities, and delivering consulting services that generated measurable results. But it had also taught me that exceptional performance within someone else's organization would always be limited by that organization's willingness to acknowledge and reward it. It was time to stop working for people who undervalued my contributions and start working for someone who would appreciate them properly, myself. The clients who trusted my judgment, the skills I had developed through 4 years of trial and error, and the industry knowledge I had accumulated through countless projects and relationships represented a foundation that could support something much more ambitious than continued employment in an organization that saw me as a supporting player rather than a strategic asset. I opened my laptop and began researching something I had been thinking about for weeks, but hadn't had the courage to pursue seriously: the requirements for starting my own consulting firm. The regulatory requirements were straightforward. The startup costs were manageable. The market opportunity was substantial, particularly for someone who already had established relationships with potential clients who were dissatisfied with their current consulting arrangements. But most importantly, I had something that no amount of capital or regulatory compliance could provide: a proven track record of generating results that clients valued enough to pay for, and relationships built on trust that couldn't be replicated through marketing or sales tactics. Premier Consulting Solutions had spent 4 years teaching me how to build a successful consulting practice, while simultaneously demonstrating why working for other people's success was a limiting strategy. For someone with entrepreneurial ambitions, the lesson was complete, and it was time to graduate to something that offered unlimited potential for both personal satisfaction and professional growth. The only question was whether I had the courage to bet everything on my own abilities, or whether I would continue accepting diminishing returns on my investment in other people's dreams. As I researched business registration requirements and drafted preliminary financial projections, I realized that the answer had already been determined by 4 years of evidence that my capabilities exceeded the opportunities available within Premier's organizational structure. It was time to find out what I could accomplish when success didn't have to be shared with people who hadn't earned it. The end came exactly as I had predicted it would, with corporate cowardice disguised as strategic restructuring. That Tuesday morning email wasn't a surprise. It was the inevitable conclusion of a story that had been building toward this moment for months. What Marcus didn't realize as he hit send on my termination notice was that he wasn't firing an employee who would quietly disappear into job search anonymity. He was liberating someone who had been preparing for this moment far longer than he had been planning it. I spent exactly 3 minutes reading and rereading those cold, impersonal sentences before closing my laptop and walking to my closet. If Premier Consulting Solutions wanted to end our relationship through electronic communication, then they would get the professional courtesy they had demonstrated. None. I dressed carefully in my best navy suit, the one I had worn to close the Pacific Industries deal 2 years earlier, and drove to the office for what would be my final performance as Sarah Morrison, loyal employee. The office felt different that morning, charged with the kind of nervous energy that accompanies poorly kept secrets. A few colleagues avoided eye contact as I walked to my desk, their discomfort suggesting they had heard rumors about management decisions before I had received official notification. Jennifer, my former assistant who had become one of my few genuine allies at Premier, caught my eye from across the room and gave me a subtle nod that conveyed both sympathy and solidarity. I spent the morning methodically cleaning out my desk, a process that took longer than expected because 4 years of professional life generates more personal artifacts than most people realize. Photos from company events where I had been honored for achievements that were now being attributed to team efforts. Thank you notes from clients expressing appreciation for work that Brad was supposedly managing. Awards and certificates recognizing performance that Marcus had decided was no longer valuable enough to retain. But I also collected items that would be useful in my next chapter. Business cards from industry contacts who had expressed interest. In future collaborations, USB drives containing backup copies of presentations and proposals I had developed, and a small notebook where I had been tracking client feedback and market insights for months. These weren't company property in any legal sense. They were the tools of professional development that belonged to the person who had created them. Marcus emerged from his office around 11, walking toward my desk with the artificially somber expression of someone who had rehearsed this conversation, but wasn't entirely comfortable with his role in it. He had probably expected me to clean out my desk quietly and leave without forcing him to acknowledge the awkwardness of firing someone whose work had built the foundation of his company's success. "Sarah, I want you to know this wasn't an easy decision," he began, his voice carrying the false sincerity of corporate damage control. "The restructuring affects several positions, and we had to make some difficult choices about organizational priorities." I looked up from the box I was packing and gave him my most professional smile. "I understand completely, Marcus. Sometimes organizations outgrow the people who helped build them. It's just business." The response seemed to catch him off guard, as if he had been prepared for tears or anger, but not for gracious acceptance. He shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to say something that would make this interaction feel less like a betrayal and more like a mutual parting of ways. "We're prepared to provide excellent references, of course," he continued, "and the severance package should give you time to explore new opportunities. I'm confident someone with your skills will find a great fit somewhere else." The implication was clear. My skills were valuable enough to recommend to other employers, but not valuable enough to retain at Premier. It was the perfect encapsulation of 4 years of being appreciated, but not rewarded, valued but not promoted, essential but not irreplaceable. "That's very generous," I replied, continuing to pack my personal items while maintaining perfect composure. "I'm sure everything will work out exactly as it should." Marcus lingered for a moment longer, perhaps expecting me to ask about the decision-making process or express regret about leaving, but I continued packing in professional silence. Finally, he retreated to his office, probably to congratulate himself on handling a difficult conversation with minimal drama. What he didn't know was that the real drama wouldn't begin until after I left the building. I finished packing around noon and made a point of saying goodbye to colleagues who had made my time at Premier worthwhile. Jennifer walked with me to the elevator, her expression mixing professional courtesy with personal concern. "This is really wrong, Sarah," she said quietly as we waited for the elevator to arrive. "Everyone knows you built this place. Brad couldn't handle your workload for a week, let alone permanently." I squeezed her shoulder gently. "Take care of yourself, Jen, and keep documenting everything. You never know when that information might become useful." She understood the implication immediately. Jennifer had been with Premier long enough to see patterns in how the company treated valuable employees, and she was smart enough to recognize that my departure might not be the end of this story. I drove home in perfect calm, feeling none of the devastation that had accompanied my mother's termination years earlier. Instead, I felt the clarity that comes from having your assumptions validated and your contingency plans activated. Premier had made their choice, and now I was free to make mine. The first call came while I was still unpacking my desk items in my apartment. Janet Morrison from Sterling Manufacturing, her voice carrying the kind of controlled urgency that comes from discovering that your trusted advisor has suddenly become unavailable. "Sarah, I just heard from Brad that you're no longer with Premier. I need to understand what this means for our ongoing projects and our strategic planning initiatives for next quarter." I had prepared for this conversation, knowing that my Departure would create immediate concerns among clients who had relied on my expertise and judgment. Janet, I appreciate your concern about project continuity. I'm confident that Premier will ensure all your deliverables are completed on schedule and to your satisfaction. That's not what I'm worried about, she replied bluntly. I'm worried about who I'm supposed to work with going forward. Brad doesn't understand our business the way you do, and frankly, we chose Premier because we wanted to work with you specifically. The opening I had been waiting for presented itself perfectly. I understand your concerns, and I want to assure you that your relationship with Sterling has been one of the most rewarding aspects of my consulting career. If Premier can't provide the level of service you need, I hope you'll consider exploring alternatives that might better meet your requirements. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, during which Janet made it clear that Sterling's satisfaction with Premier was entirely dependent on my involvement in their projects. When I mentioned that I was exploring independent consulting opportunities, her interest became unmistakable. If you decide to strike out on your own, Sarah, I want to be your first call. We have several initiatives that would benefit from your strategic perspective. And honestly, working with you directly would eliminate a lot of the bureaucratic complications we've experienced with Premier. The second call came an hour later from Tom Chen at Meridian Financial, expressing identical concerns about project continuity and similar interest in maintaining our working relationship regardless of my employment status. The third call, from Patricia Wells at Pacific Industries, included a specific request for me to submit a proposal for independent consulting services on projects that Premier had been developing for months. By the end of the week, I had received calls from 6 major clients expressing dissatisfaction with Premier's handling of their accounts in my absence and interest in working with me directly. These weren't casual inquiries, they were explicit. Invitations to compete for business that Premier assumed belonged to them by virtue of existing contracts and organizational relationships. But the most satisfying call came from Jennifer, exactly 10 days after my departure. Her voice carried the barely controlled excitement of someone who had witnessed a spectacular corporate meltdown firsthand. Sarah, you need to know what's happening over here. It's complete chaos. Brad tried to handle the Sterling presentation on his own and completely botched the quarterly review. Janet Morrison called Marcus directly to complain about the quality of service and specifically asked when you would be returning. When Marcus told her you were no longer with the company, she said they would be reevaluating their consulting relationships. The dominoes were falling exactly as I had anticipated. Client relationships built on personal trust and professional competence couldn't be transferred through organizational charts or preserved through contract language. When the trusted advisor disappeared, the trust disappeared with her, leaving Premier to discover how little client loyalty they had actually earned through their own efforts. It gets worse, Jennifer continued. Meridian Financial terminated their contract early, citing concerns about service quality and strategic continuity. Pacific Industries postponed their expansion project indefinitely, saying they needed to find consultants who better understood their business requirements. Marcus is in full panic mode, trying to figure out how to replace the revenue you generated while also dealing with Brad's complete inability to handle client relationships. The financial impact was immediate and severe. Premier's quarterly revenue projections, which had been based on the assumption that my client relationships would remain intact after my departure, were reduced by nearly 60% within 2 weeks of my termination. The company that had grown from 12 employees to 47 on the strength of my business development efforts was suddenly facing the possibility of downsizing back to survival mode. But I wasn't content to simply watch Premier struggle with the consequences of their poor decisions. I had spent months preparing for this moment, and it was time to execute the strategy I had been developing since Marcus's insulting performance review. Morrison Strategic Consulting officially launched 6 weeks after my departure from Premier, with a client roster that included Sterling Manufacturing, Meridian Financial Services, and Pacific Industries. The business registration process had been surprisingly straightforward, and the startup costs were manageable thanks to the severance package Premier had provided and the emergency fund I had been building for exactly this scenario. My first proposal to Sterling Manufacturing was for a comprehensive supply chain optimization review that built on the work I had been doing for them at Premier, but with expanded scope and more aggressive timelines than Premier's bureaucratic structure could have supported. The contract value was $2, $8 million over 18 months, representing not just recovered revenue but growth beyond what Sterling had been willing to commit to Premier. Meridian Financial Services contracted for risk management consulting that incorporated regulatory compliance strategies I had been developing during my final months at Premier. The engagement was worth $1, $9 million, and included provisions for ongoing advisory services that could extend the relationship for years. Most importantly, Tom Chen specifically requested that I serve as their primary strategic advisor, a role that Premier had never been willing to give me despite 4 years of proven performance. Pacific Industries presented the most ambitious opportunity, a multi-phase consulting engagement to support their expansion into European markets, leveraging my understanding of their operations and my network of international business contacts. The initial contract was valued at $1 million, with options for additional phases that could total more than $8 million over 3 years. Within 90 days of launching Morrison Strategic Consulting, I had signed contracts worth $7, $8 million in total value, representing not just the clients Premier had lost, but expanded relationships that generated more revenue than Premier had ever been able to capture. The difference was simple. When clients worked with me directly, they got the strategic thinking and personalized attention that had always been filtered through Premier's organizational layers and competing priorities. But the most satisfying moment came when Marcus called me directly, 6 months after my termination. His voice carried none of the confident authority I remembered from our corporate interactions, replaced by the desperate courtesy of someone who needed something he couldn't demand. "Sarah, I hope you're doing well in your new venture. I'm calling because we're facing some challenges with client retention, and several of our major accounts have specifically asked about working with you again. I wanted to explore whether there might be opportunities for collaboration between Morrison Strategic and Premier." Collaboration. The same word he had used to criticize my resistance to Brad's incompetent leadership, now repurposed as a euphemism for begging me to save the company I had built and he had dismantled through poor judgment and worse management. "I appreciate the call, Marcus," I replied with perfect professional courtesy. Morrison Strategic is focused on serving clients who value strategic thinking and operational excellence. If Premier has clients who are looking for that kind of consulting relationship, I'd be happy to discuss how we might help them achieve their objectives. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in role reversal. Marcus, who had spent 4 years positioning himself as the strategic visionary while I handled execution, was now asking me to consider subcontracting arrangements that would allow Premier to retain clients who refused to work with anyone else. The man who had criticized my collaboration skills was proposing that I collaborate with him to save his company from the consequences of losing me. But I had moved beyond the limitations of employment relationships and subcontracting arrangements. Morrison Strategic Consulting wasn't competing with Premier. It was operating in a different category entirely, providing services that Premier had never been able to deliver because their organizational structure prioritized politics over performance. "Marcus, I think you misunderstand the nature of what I'm building here," I said calmly. "This isn't about individual consulting relationships or project-based collaborations. This is about creating a consulting practice that puts client results ahead of corporate hierarchy, that rewards performance instead of politics, and that builds long-term relationships based on trust rather than contract obligations." The silence, on his end, stretched long enough for me to understand that he was finally grasping the full implications of his decision to terminate my employment. He hadn't just lost an employee. He had created a competitor who understood his business better than he did and had relationships with his most valuable clients. "Sarah, if there's anything we can do to make things right, any way we can work together going forward, I hope you'll consider it. Premier wouldn't be where it is today without your contributions, and I regret that our organizational changes didn't better reflect that reality. It was the closest thing to an apology I would ever receive from Marcus Thompson, and it came 6 months too late to matter. But it was also validation that my assessment of Premier's dependence on my contributions had been accurate, and that my decision to build something independent had been the right choice for both my career and my clients. Marcus, I appreciate the acknowledgement, but Morrison Strategic is focused on the future rather than the past. Premier taught me everything I needed to know about building client relationships and delivering consulting services. And for that, education, I'm genuinely grateful. But it also taught me that the best way to serve clients is to build an organization that puts their needs first. And that's exactly what I've done. A year after launching Morrison Strategic Consulting, my client roster had expanded to include 12 major corporations, with total contracted revenue exceeding $12 million. I had hired Jennifer as my director of operations, along with 3 senior consultants who had left Premier and other firms to join an organization that promised career advancement based on performance rather than politics. The office space I leased in downtown Chicago offered better views than Premier's headquarters, and the company culture I was building emphasized collaboration in the true sense of the word, people working together to achieve shared objectives rather than competing. For credit and recognition, every employee at Morrison Strategic had equity participation, ensuring that the value we created together would be shared by the people who contributed to it. But the most rewarding aspect of building my own consulting firm wasn't the financial success or the professional recognition. It was the daily satisfaction of working with clients who valued strategic thinking, with colleagues who were committed to excellence, and within an organizational structure that rewarded the behaviors that actually generated results. Premier. Consulting Solutions, meanwhile, had contracted to fewer than 20 employees and was reportedly exploring acquisition offers from larger firms that could provide the stability and expertise that Marcus's leadership had failed to maintain. Brad Peterson had left to pursue opportunities in real estate development, and Marcus himself was rumored to be considering early retirement rather than continuing to manage a company that had never recovered from losing its primary revenue generator. The story had come full circle, but with a different ending than my mother's experience 30 years earlier. Where she had been discarded by an organization that saw her as expendable, I had built an organization that made me indispensable. Where she had accepted termination as an inevitable consequence of corporate loyalty, I had transformed termination into the liberation that allowed me to build something better. The lesson wasn't about revenge or proving critics wrong. It was about understanding that your professional worth isn't determined by other people's willingness to recognize it, and that sometimes the best response to being undervalued is to create an environment where value is properly appreciated and rewarded. When people ask me about the decision to leave Premier and start Morrison Strategic, I tell them it wasn't really a decision at all. It was the inevitable result of 4 years of evidence that my capabilities exceeded the opportunities available within someone else's organizational structure. Premier didn't fire me. They liberated me to build something that could fully utilize the skills they had been wasting through poor management and worse judgment. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to an ambitious professional is being forced to bet everything on their own abilities. In my case, that bet paid off beyond anything I could have achieved while working to make other people successful. The $15 million in business I had generated for Premier was just the beginning of what I could accomplish when success didn't have to be shared with people who hadn't earned it. The corporate world will chew you up and spit you out, but only if you let it. Sometimes the smartest response to being undervalued is to take your value somewhere it will be properly appreciated, even if that means creating that place yourself. The transformation of my professional life reached its pinnacle 18 months after that cold Tuesday morning termination email, but not in the way I had originally envisioned. Success, I discovered, wasn't just about proving that Premier had made a catastrophic mistake in letting me go. It was about building something so fundamentally superior that their mistake became irrelevant to everyone, except the people who had to live with its consequences. Morrison Strategic Consulting had evolved beyond my initial vision of a boutique firm serving a handful of displaced premier clients. We had become a recognized leader in strategic consulting for mid-market companies, with a reputation for delivering results that larger firms promised but rarely achieved. Our client retention rate exceeded 97%. Our project success metrics outperformed industry standards by significant margins, and our revenue growth trajectory attracted attention from industry publications and potential investors who saw our model as the future of consulting services. But the real measure of our success wasn't financial metrics or industry recognition. It was the quality of professional relationships we had built with clients who trusted our judgment, colleagues who were invested in our shared success, and an organizational culture that rewarded excellence rather than politics. Every day at Morrison Strategic felt like validation that the frustrations I had experienced at Premier weren't inevitable aspects of corporate life, but symptoms of poor leadership and misaligned priorities. The irony wasn't lost on me that Premier's attempt to diminish my role had actually forced me to expand it beyond anything I could have achieved within their organizational constraints. As an employee, I had been responsible for individual client relationships and specific project deliverables. As the founder and CEO of Morrison Strategic, I was responsible for strategic vision, organizational culture, talent development, and long-term business growth. Premier had refused to promote me to VP of Business Development. The market had promoted me to Chief Executive Officer. Jennifer, who had become my most trusted advisor and closest friend during our transition from Premier colleagues to Morrison Strategic Partners, often reminded me of how dramatically our professional circumstances had changed. "Do you ever miss the simplicity of just being responsible for your own work?" she asked during one of our weekly strategy sessions, as we reviewed proposals for 3 major engagements that would expand our operations into new geographic markets. The question made me laugh, not from amusement, but from the recognition of how completely my perspective had shifted. "I don't think I was ever just responsible for my own work," I replied. "At Premier, I was responsible for my work, Brad's mistakes, Marcus's promises, and the company's reputation with every client I touched. The difference now is that I'm building something that can support that level of responsibility rather than being exploited by it." The distinction was crucial. At Premier, my willingness to take ownership of problems I hadn't created and deliver results beyond my job description had been taken for granted and ultimately used against me. At Morrison Strategic, that same drive for excellence was channeled into building systems, developing talent, and creating value that benefited everyone who contributed to our success. Our most significant breakthrough came when Douglas Manufacturing, a Fortune 500 company that had never worked with Premier, approached us to lead their digital transformation initiative. The engagement was potentially worth $15 million over 3 years, representing not just significant revenue, but validation that Morrison Strategic had transcended our origins as a Premier spin-off to become a legitimate competitor in the upper tiers of the consulting market. The proposal process was unlike anything I had experienced during my Premier years. Instead of competing against other consulting firms on price and promises, we were competing on demonstrated expertise and proven methodology. Douglas Manufacturing had done their research on our track record, spoken with our existing clients, and concluded that our approach to strategic consulting offered advantages that larger firms couldn't match. The presentation took place in Douglas Manufacturing's corporate headquarters in Milwaukee, an imposing glass structure that reflected the company's position as a leader in industrial manufacturing. The boardroom was filled with executives who had worked with McKinsey, Deloitte, and other prestigious consulting firms. People who had high expectations and limited patience for consultants who couldn't deliver immediate value. But I wasn't the same person who had nervously presented to Sterling Manufacturing 4 years earlier, hoping to land my first major client for a company that barely had enough resources to support the engagement. I was the CEO of a consulting firm with a documented track record of success, leading a team of professionals who had chosen to work with me because they believed in our vision and capabilities. The presentation itself was a masterclass in strategic thinking and client focus. We didn't just propose solutions to Douglas Manufacturing's stated challenges. We identified underlying issues they hadn't fully recognized and demonstrated how addressing those root causes would generate value far beyond their initial objectives. We didn't just promise results. We showed them our methodology for measuring progress and ensuring accountability throughout the engagement. Most importantly, we didn't present ourselves as vendors hoping to win their business. We positioned ourselves as strategic partners who could help them achieve objectives that would transform their competitive position in the marketplace. The difference in approach reflected 4 years of learning how to build consulting relationships that generated mutual value rather than one-sided benefit. The questions that followed our presentation were detailed, challenging, and exactly the kind of inquiry that separated serious prospects from companies that were just exploring options. Douglas Manufacturing's CEO asked about our scalability and resource allocation strategies. Their CFO questioned our pricing model and value delivery timelines. Their Chief Operating Officer wanted to understand how our methodology would integrate with their existing systems and processes. But the most telling question came from their Chief Strategy Officer, who asked directly about our competitive advantages relative to larger consulting firms. "What can Morrison Strategic deliver that McKinsey can't?" she asked, her tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. The answer came from 4 years of experience at Premier and 18 months of building something better. McKinsey can deliver excellent strategic thinking and proven methodologies, I replied, but they can't deliver the kind of personalized attention and organizational agility that allows for real-time adaptation as your needs evolve. When you work with Morrison Strategic, you're not getting a junior consultant supervised by a partner who visits monthly. You're getting senior-level strategic thinking from people who are personally invested in your success and who have the authority to make decisions quickly when circumstances change. The response seemed to resonate throughout the room. These were executives who had experienced the frustrations of working with consulting firms that overpromised and underdelivered, that assigned inexperienced consultants to important projects, and that prioritized their own processes over client objectives. They were looking for something different, and Morrison Strategic represented exactly the kind of alternative they had been seeking. 3 weeks later, Douglas Manufacturing awarded us the digital transformation engagement, with a contract value that exceeded our initial projections and included performance bonuses tied to measurable business outcomes. The announcement generated significant industry attention, positioning Morrison Strategic as the emerging leader in strategic consulting and attracting inquiries from other Fortune 500 companies that were reconsidering their consulting relationships. But success at this level also brought unexpected challenges and opportunities that forced me to confront questions about the future direction of Morrison Strategic. Several private equity firms approached us about potential investments that would accelerate our growth and expand our capabilities. Industry publications wanted to feature our story as an example of entrepreneurial success in the consulting sector. Competitors began trying to recruit our senior consultants with offers that reflected our growing reputation for excellence. Most significantly, we received an acquisition offer from Meridian Consulting Group, a national firm that wanted to purchase Morrison Strategic as part of their expansion into the Chicago market. The offer was substantial enough to make everyone at Morrison Strategic financially independent, but it also represented exactly the kind of corporate integration that I had left Premier to avoid. The decision process took 3 months and involved extensive discussions with our entire team about what we wanted Morrison Strategic to become. Some colleagues were attracted to the financial security and expanded resources that acquisition would provide. Others were concerned about losing the organizational culture and decision-making autonomy that made Morrison Strategic different from traditional consulting firms. Jennifer, whose judgment I had learned to trust completely, summarized, the dilemma perfectly during one of our late-night strategy sessions. "The question isn't whether Meridian's offer is financially attractive," she said, reviewing the acquisition terms for the dozenth time. "The question is whether we built Morrison Strategic to cash out or to create something that can outlast all of us." The insight crystallized everything I had been thinking about Morrison Strategic's future. We hadn't built the company to prove a point about Premier's poor judgment or to generate a quick financial return on our entrepreneurial investment. We had built it to create the kind of consulting firm we had always wanted to work for. One that prioritized client results over internal politics and rewarded performance over hierarchy. I declined Meridian's acquisition offer and instead announced Morrison Strategic's next phase of growth: expansion into additional markets with equity participation for senior consultants who shared our vision and commitment to excellence. Rather than selling what we had built, we would scale it by attracting professionals who were experiencing the same frustrations with traditional consulting firms that had driven us to create something better. The expansion strategy worked beyond our most optimistic projections. Within 6 months, we had opened offices in Detroit and Indianapolis, staffed by senior consultants who had left established firms to join Morrison Strategic's equity sharing model. Our client base expanded to include manufacturers, financial services companies, and technology firms throughout the Midwest, all drawn by our reputation for delivering measurable results through personalized strategic consulting. By the second anniversary of Morrison Strategic's founding, we had generated over $28 million in total revenue, employed 37 professionals across 3 offices, and established strategic partnerships with specialized firms that extended our capabilities into areas like technology implementation and organizational development. Our success had attracted attention from business schools that wanted to study our model, industry associations that invited me to speak at conferences, and publications that featured Morrison Strategic as an example of successful entrepreneurship in professional services. But the most satisfying validation came from an unexpected source: a call from Tom Chen at Meridian Financial Services, who had been one of my first clients to defect from Premier after my termination. "Sarah, I wanted you to know that our board just approved a resolution recognizing Morrison Strategic as Vendor of the Year," he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had made an excellent decision and seen it validated over time. "In 5 years of working with consulting firms, we've never had a strategic partner who consistently delivered results that exceeded our expectations while also improving our internal capabilities." The recognition was meaningful not just for its financial implications, but for what it represented about the relationship-building approach that had always been central to my consulting philosophy. Meridian Financial wasn't just paying for project deliverables. They were investing in a strategic partnership that generated ongoing value through knowledge transfer, capability development, and long-term relationship benefits that extended far beyond individual engagements. 3 years after receiving that termination email from Premier, I found myself in a position I could never have imagined during my most optimistic moments as an undervalued employee. Morrison Strategic Consulting had become everything Premier could have been if it had been led by people who understood that sustainable success comes from developing talent rather than exploiting it, from building client relationships rather than managing vendor transactions, and from creating organizational cultures that reward excellence rather than politics. The final chapter of the Premier story came not through dramatic confrontation or public vindication, but through the quiet satisfaction of irrelevance. Marcus Thompson's consulting firm had been acquired by a regional competitor for a fraction of what Morrison Strategic was worth, and Marcus himself had taken early retirement to pursue interests that didn't involve managing people whose capabilities exceeded his ability to recognize them. Brad Peterson had found success in commercial real estate, a field better suited to his networking skills and less dependent on strategic thinking or client relationship management. Several former Premier colleagues had joined Morrison Strategic, or other firms where their talents were better appreciated and more appropriately rewarded. The building that had housed Premier Consulting Solutions now hosted a different tenant entirely, and the conference room where Marcus had delivered my humiliating performance review had been converted to office space for a technology startup. That probably had no idea of the corporate drama that had once unfolded within those walls. But Premier's fate was ultimately less important than what its demise had made possible. By undervaluing the person who had built their success, they had forced me to build something better. By refusing to promote me to a position commensurate with my contributions, they had pushed me to create a position that exceeded anything they could have offered. By terminating my employment to make room for someone less qualified, they had liberated me to compete with them using advantages they had unknowingly helped me develop. The lesson wasn't about revenge or proving critics wrong. It was about understanding that professional worth isn't determined by other people's willingness to recognize it, and that sometimes the best response to being undervalued is to create an environment where value is properly appreciated and rewarded. When young professionals ask me about dealing with workplace frustration or career stagnation, I tell them that the most important skill they can develop is the ability to document their contributions and understand their market value independent of their current employer's assessment. Organizations that take exceptional performance for granted will continue doing so until exceptional performers stop accepting that treatment. But I also tell them that leaving a bad situation is only half the solution. The other half is building something better, whether that means finding an employer who appreciates their capabilities or creating their own opportunity to demonstrate what they can accomplish when success doesn't have to be shared with people who haven't earned it. Morrison's Strategic Consulting exists today because Premier Consulting Solutions taught me everything I needed to know about building a successful consulting practice, while simultaneously demonstrating why working for other people's success was a limiting strategy for someone with entrepreneurial capabilities. The education was expensive in terms of time and frustration, but it was comprehensive in ways that no business school or professional development program could have provided. Standing in Morrison's Strategic's Chicago headquarters, looking out over Lake Michigan from offices that offered better views than Premier ever had, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from undervalued employee to successful entrepreneur. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been driven by anger or spite. It had been the result of careful planning, strategic thinking, and the willingness to bet everything on my own abilities when other people's organizations proved inadequate to support them. The corporate world will always have companies like Premier, led by people like Marcus Thompson, who mistake politics for strategy and confuse hierarchy with leadership. But it will also have opportunities for people who understand that exceptional performance creates options, that client relationships belong to the person who builds them, and that sometimes the smartest career move is the one that requires the most courage. Morrison Strategic Consulting started as a response to being undervalued at Premier, but it evolved into something much more significant. Proof that building something yourself is often more rewarding than working to make other people successful. The $15 million in business I had generated for Premier was just the beginning of what became possible when that same capability was applied to building something that couldn't be taken away by someone else's poor judgment. The best revenge, I learned, isn't destruction of your former employer. It's building something so superior that their continued existence becomes irrelevant to your success. And sometimes the best thing that can happen to an ambitious professional is being forced to discover just how much they can accomplish when they stop accepting other people's limitations as their own. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.